Thank you so much for coming tonight. I imagine there'll be a few more people wandering in. This is the 2018-19 Stilaccio Lecture Series at Illinois Wesleyan. My name is Carmen Lozar, and it's my pleasure to welcome 3 special people tonight, not just this one. Our guest artist, Harrow, has traveled from Colorado to present to you. And then there's 2 other people who conceived and supported this lecture series for the last 12 years. IW alum Sherry Stilaccio and her son, artist Anthony Stilaccio. And could we just So I'd like to invite Anthony, if you wouldn't mind, just to say a few words. Would you mind? Thank you. Thank you.
Good evening. It's nice to see you all here. So, I'm the Executive Director of Studio Potter and also the International Coordinator for Artaxis, which is an online community of mostly ceramic artists. I need to plug both of them. Apologies, but it's obligatory. So check out Studio Potter. It's excellent writing in the field of ceramics. Del has been a contributor in the past. And actually this Tuesday, October 9th, Artaxis is running an event called Artaxis Conversations, where we'll have presentations by Tyler Lott, who's at ISU nearby, and many other interesting ceramic and mixed media artists. So tune in online to Artaxis and check that out. As Carmen mentioned, my mother and I support this lecture series. I'm the namesake, and my mother and I support it because we believe so firmly in the value of the arts, and I'd like to just use my mother as an example. She grew up here in Illinois, not far from Bloomington, attended Wesleyan, and it was music, which she studied here, that took her out of the Midwest. Thankfully, according to her reports, it was high time, she said. And that took her to Japan, where she met a young sailor who became my father. And when my father passed away in 1987, it was music, the performance of music and listening to music, that helped my mother through the darkest period of her life. And after that, she went back to get her PhD in music and began teaching at the Peabody Conservatory in Baltimore, where she retired from. And with that job, supported her 2 teenage sons. 3 or 4 years ago, my mom was diagnosed with dementia, and she has exhibited remarkably slow progression, according to her doctor. And I would attribute that, I'm not a scientist, but I would most definitely attribute that to the fact that she plays music, sings, plays piano, and listens to music every day of her life. The arts are an integral part of our physical, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual well-being. And that's why we support this program, because it is the cornerstone of our lives in many ways. And I can't imagine a life, I can't imagine a mental world, an emotional world, a spiritual world, or even a physical one without the nurturing of the arts. So I hope you all will, whether you're an art major or just taking an art class here, I hope you will enjoy it, soak it up, keep it with you, as I hope you also do with Del's lecture. And I'd like to welcome Del Harrow to the stage.
Thank you so much, Anthony. That was really beautiful. Thank you guys all for coming. Thanks for having me here. I'm going to talk for a little while about my work and some ideas and projects, and then hopefully I'll get through that in a pretty efficient way so that there's a little bit of time and energy left among us for questions and some conversation, which is always the most fun and interesting part for me. I'm going to move back and forth a little bit between reading and speaking more extemporaneously, so there will be some little shifts in tone throughout the talk, so hopefully everybody can follow me with that. So thank you so much for inviting me to give the 2018 Anthony Stilaccio lecture. I was looking back at some of the past presenters, and it's a real honor to be invited to give such a prominent lecture. And I also feel, often when one is invited to give a named lecture like this, the Anthony Stilaccio lecture, as an artist, I often feel like there's something a little bit awkward about it, in that typically when you're asked to give an artist talk, you talk about your own work, and that's the subject of the lecture. And a named lecture like this, maybe it's just me, but it seems to kind of imply or point towards a lecture that involves a larger theme or subject. So maybe in response to this, as my own sort of response to this, what I'd like to do is to give a lecture which is sort of two parts, but that are connected together. I'd like to begin by talking a little bit about, in a very large sense, about some thoughts that I have about kind of the deep history of ceramics and humans sort of making ceramic objects. And then I'd like to use some ideas from that to then provide a kind of framework for talking about a few of my own projects that I've made in the last maybe 15 years. And hopefully I'll get through all of that pretty efficiently, and there will be some time and energy left for questions and some conversation, which is also the most fun, always the most fun and interesting part of these things for me. So I'm going to move back and forth a little bit between reading and then just speaking. So there will be some little shifts in tone and pace, which I hope is okay, and I hope everyone can follow me. So I live and work in Fort Collins, Colorado. I'm a professor at Colorado State University, where I teach sculpture, digital fabrication, and pottery. In the pottery area, I teach alongside Sanam Amami. This is a beautiful piece of hers. She's an amazing potter and teacher. And we're also married, and we have a son together named William. He's 3 years old. Having two artists and teachers and two careers in one house, our lives are really organized around all of these parts, around our son, our teaching, and then our work in the studio and our work with ceramics. I'm very interested in the idea and question of context for our work, all of our work. We don't make work in a vacuum. All of these conditions and factors profoundly not only influence, but actually give shape to, I think, the work that we make. And there are a number of different ways that any of us as contemporary artists can talk about context or histories in which our work exists and from which our work grows. So another way that I might talk about the context for my work is in the context of modernist sculpture. Artists like Constantine Brancusi, Barbara Hepworth, Agnes Martin. I also think about and look at a lot of contemporary artists. Vincent Fecteau, whose work is pictured here, Ricky Swallow, Magdalene Adundo. I don't use one material exclusively in my work, but a long and sustained work with clay, and a work in a way that's really rooted in craft and technique, really orients all of the sculpture I make, even when I work in other materials. Because of this kind of use of clay, not only the use of clay, but also this orientation of clay, another context for my work that feels deeply relevant is a much longer history. In fact, the 27,000-year history of humans making things out of clay. And there are way too many objects from this history that I think about all the time to refer to them all or show them all here. But I want to begin with just a few to frame some of the ideas that I'd like to talk about in my own work. So this first piece on the screen starts at the beginning, literally. This is a Venus figure found in the present-day Czech Republic. It's actually the oldest archaeological record of humans working in clay, from about 24,000 BC. And one really fascinating theory around these types of Venus figures is that this really full, vertically compressed, kind of voluptuous form is actually the result of a kind of foreshortening. So it comes from the foreshortening of the maker looking down at her own body. And I think the act with which this object represents, this act of looking down at our own bodies from inside of our bodies, and then with our bodies, through our hands, attempting to give form to this act of looking, to trying to see the thing from inside of the thing, feels like a fundamental and profound kind of experience as a human maker. The ceramic vessel really continues this idea. So it's an expression of this duality of interior and exterior, of subject and object, and the impossibility of being both inside and outside of a thing at the same time. The vessel is a container of space and of volume, but also a container of this kind of thinking about the body. This piece on the left is called the Steely of Cyrus. This in the surface is a kind of a cuneiform writing which records the empire of an early Mesopotamian king. Early archaeologists actually interpreted this text as a first move, first indication of a move towards a kind of democratic government. And the reason they thought this is because the text describes really the full breadth of races and classes present in the kingdom. Later archaeologists have reconsidered this, and now they think of it as something closer to a kind of census taking, rather than the evidence of a particularly democratic or magnanimous ruler. But in any case, it's really the nature of the material of clay, its plasticity, its ability to take impressions and record marks that has allowed it to function really as a technology for recording. It allows us to project our lives today into the deep past. The final image I'd like to show on the right records another kind of human mark. These clay balls were found in present-day Syria, and they actually are the part of the oldest archaeological record of organized warfare. So the impressions of hands pressing into the soft clay that was then hardened and hurled at an enemy reminds me that, and all of us, I think, that this ability of the material and the way in which it records the mark of the hand doesn't always record beauty or our aesthetic achievements and our highest aspirations, our aspirations towards progress, democracy, and equity. It can also record our desire to dominate, and the ways in which to dominate nature, to dominate each other, and the ways in which our darker nature so often undermines other kinds of progress. So when I talk about putting the things that I make in some of my projects into this longer context of ceramic objects, in the context of clay, I mean not only clay as a material, but also the way things the way clay things have been made. The vast range of ways clay has been refined, processed, and formed through traditions of craft. I'm very interested in technology, and when I say technology, I don't just mean the more limited, modern way in which we use that word. It doesn't normally refers today to basically machines and computers. But I'm also interested in looking back more deeply to the etymological origins of the word technology, which came from the ancient Greek concept of techne. And the concept of techne would include not only things like machines and computers, but also the whole realm of instrumental or applied knowledge. So this would include the crafts, along with all forms of ritual, practice, and even manners. The idea of manners. And in this sense, I would say my thinking about techne really contrasts with the ancient Greeks now. And in the ancient Greek philosophical tradition, they created a split, a division in the realm of human experience, where they divided human experience between techne, which was applied knowledge, and this concept of episteme, or empirical, or direct knowledge. My own thinking, though, really follows that of the philosopher Bernard Stiegler, and his conviction that techne is actually inseparable from all human experience. And in this, he means that techne, with the cadence of craft, the temporal dimension of ritual practices, the way it gives birth to culture and artifacts, creates the ability, actually, for a lived experience today to extend back into the past. And it's this that creates the very fabric of our human experience of time, and our human understanding of time. And in fact, it is time that creates then the stage or framework for all human experience. So in this larger sense of technology as techne, ceramics is not only a material. Ceramics itself is also a technology. The applied function of ceramics as technology then is to make things, but it is also a tool that we use to think with. Technology, clay as technology, is a mind that we make. And the shape of the ceramic mind is given shape by the structure of the material. Because of its shape and its properties, there are thoughts that are particularly good to think with clay. And these thoughts or problems create a framework for the genres of ceramic work broadly. And I think they also create a framework for much of the work and projects that I've made out of clay. So some of these underlying ceramic ideas or problems, I believe, include first this question of technology, these questions of technology, the nature of technology, and questions in relation to the idea of the deep history of technology. A second ceramic idea that I come back to over and over in my own work is this idea of ceramic containers or vessels as a form through which to think about the experience of the body. And the third idea is, and I'll talk about this in a number of different ways, but the ideas about the relationship between parts and wholes. So I'd like to switch now to talking about some of my own projects, and in a more specific and kind of concrete way, but using these three concepts or ideas to organize and kind of frame the way I'm talking about that work. So I'd like to begin with this piece that I made a number of years ago now, maybe 8 or so years ago now. And this piece was about this idea that potters often talk about. They talk about this idea of the breath of a pot. And making this piece became a way of trying to think about and understand this sort of enigmatic notion of a pot having breath. So the way the piece began was with 2 historical forms, and I sort of thought I knew what was meant by this idea. My thinking was that it had something to do with the kind of distribution of volume in the form. So I went and found 2 historical forms that felt like they kind of exemplified an extreme of inhale and exhale of a pot. From there, I created a little computer animation which kind of morphed back and forth between these 2 forms. And then I wanted to make a series of objects, of vessel forms, and instead of representing sort of one fixed point on this continuum, I wanted to create a series which represented a kind of movement, right? Or maybe a more dynamic aspect of breathing, of inhaling and exhaling. And I decided to make the series then by using a mold, and using a technology that I'd been sort of experimenting with and developing along with a number of people over a few years, of using a computer-controlled milling machine to carve a plaster mold reductively. And once I decided to, to use this process, initially I thought, oh, well, I want to make, 10 or 11 of these forms. I'll make 10 or 11 different molds. But over time I started thinking that, particularly kind of germane to the concept, it would be interesting to think about how to make the mold itself a more dynamic rather than a static sort of form. So instead of making a mold for each of the 11 forms, I thought it would be interesting to try to make a number of forms all from one mold. And the way I decided to do this was by using the CNC machine not to just carve this mold once, but to carve it repeatedly, over and over again. So the way the piece was made, I carved the initial mold, I cast the form in porcelain, and then I put the mold back on the milling machine, kind of reorienting it and registering it. And then cast the mold again, and then put it back on the milling machine, carve more material away, cast the mold again, and repeated this process over and over again until I had 11 different forms that moved between these 2 objects. And then each time that the mold was carved, the tooling marks, which I sort of programmed in a way that they would be a kind of subtle texture in the surface of the objects. The tooling marks rotated slightly, so from left to right. And there are parts of the mold, actually, because of the nature of the shapes, that is carved away, and parts of the mold that is left after each step in the sequence. So as you move through the forms, you see this rotation of the tooling marks as a kind of record, another kind of record of the process of removing material from the mold. And then this is how the piece was finally shown inside of this kind of custom-made cabinet hanging on the wall with an interior kind of illumination system, a little cove light in the top back. This is a second, more recent piece and another sort of iteration in this larger series. Often, you know, when I make multiple pieces kind of responding to the same idea, the subsequent pieces will come out of a feeling that, you know, maybe there was something missing, or something about the kind of underlying subject that the first piece didn't quite get at. And I think with the second piece, you know, the question for me was how in the piece you just saw, you know, the this idea of breath seemed to be mostly about represented mostly in the profile of the form. And I was interested in this question of sort of inflation and deflation as maybe a more, a kind of collapse of a form that had a feeling of having more maybe at risk in that collapse for the kind of fundamental nature of the form. So this is the second piece in that series. This is a piece that I just completed, and the title of this piece is Vase Elegy. And with the title, you know, I was very interested in this idea of elegy in poetry as a genre of work, which is, I think, traditionally understood as this idea of a kind of lament, or a lament for the dead. And I also felt like, you know, with this piece, this kind of idea of an object which is a sort of reflection of a body, but also, you know, represents some notion of an ability of a thing to contain, to hold, and then that ability to contain somehow imploding or being sort of fundamentally at risk. It was, you know, an idea that felt actually very timely for me. Something I've been feeling a lot recently. You know, both I think in relation to just thinking about, you know, in personal, I've been thinking about mortality a lot. I think in relation to having a son, thinking about aging, but also in some larger senses of, you know, thinking about our country right now and our political situation, and this notion of a country or a nation, right, as something which somehow holds some sort of fullness of possibilities, and that this maybe is in some way sort of collapsing or fundamentally at risk, was another sort of realm of ideas that I felt that this piece was a way of beginning to try to think through. And in this, there was a second idea, description of elegy, this genre of elegy and poetry that I felt is maybe even rings even more true for my intent or hopes with this piece. And this came from an introduction for a group of poems by Ezra Pound. And in the introduction, the author writes that the most traditional impulses of elegy are grief transmuted into consolation, the work of mourning at last finding solace in the regenerative energies of nature. And the author of that introduction was Richard Seaberth. So many of the pieces I've made involve or use some combination of a ceramic object or a series of ceramic objects. either framed or supported in some way by a wooden structure or piece of furniture. And when I started making these wooden pieces, I made them in a way that was very, very quick, kind of provisional, right? I would just sort of glue them together and stick them together with nails. And over time, I've become more and more interested in the sort of structural integrity of these objects and questions of craft extending to both the ceramic forms but also the wood forms that support or frame them. So basically, I've started building them in a better and better, more and more detail-oriented way, a way that's more sort of concerned with their longevity and kind of structural integrity. So this is a detail of building that, the cabinet you just saw in the image, where I'll use the CNC milling machine. I'll design and then cut blind finger joints to connect all of the parts of the cabinet together. And then also I was interested in kind of softening the interior of this cabinet. So I laminated together plywood and then used the CNC milling machine to cut these kind of radiuses that fit together to turn the creases in the interior of the cabinet into these sort of softened curves. And then this second piece was made, it wasn't made with just one mold. It was actually made with 5 different large 6-part molds. And the pieces are made, rather than by slip casting, they're made with a press molding process where I lay slabs into each part of each mold and press the slabs by hand against the plaster, put all of the plaster mold parts together, let the piece dry or set up a little bit, and then pull those pieces apart. This is a series of sculptures that I've been working on recently that I think of as some sitting somewhere between the idea of a container and an idea of a conduit. So something that holds material, holds space, holds kind of volume, and also allows for a kind of passage through, and a complex sort of passage through. These pieces, for me, really come out of another kind of layer, I think, of this idea of ceramic vessels or volumes as a kind of in their relationship with the body, but a reflection of another kind of bodily experience. And they were in part inspired by these ancient bowls from the Mimbres culture, which was in southwestern New Mexico. And these bowls, the way they were used, they're these beautifully crafted, beautifully decorated bowls with these kind of geometric patterns, which also contain figures, representations of animals. And these bowls were placed on the faces of the dead, so they were used in burial rituals. And then after they were made, they were pierced through the center. And the story goes that they were pierced after they were placed on the body. So a nail was driven through the bowl and through the head. And that this was a way of allowing for the soul to escape the body. So this kind of duality of a container which contains, which holds space or volume, in a material kind of practical sense, but which also needs that physical function to be interrupted or broken in order to enact a more profound or kind of spiritual kind of holding and releasing of contents is one, I think, sort of an incredible idea, but also an idea which in various ways humans have always sort of used ceramics to as a material through which to kind of try to understand or comprehend that notion. And I think, it comes back to a sort of fundamental duality that we feel in our own bodies, right? Our bodies are at one and the same time a kind of container. They seem to sort of hold identity, hold, some sort of notion of the soul, of the self, right? And at the same time, as we know from science, all of the cells of our body are shed over time. And so the notion that that body sort of holds any kind of physical sort of permanent status is an illusion, is ephemeral. This is part of a series of pieces. The title of these pieces is largely Mapplethorpe, and these pieces come from a kind of hybrid. They were inspired both by kind of two famous photographs by Robert Mapplethorpe, man in a polyester suit, and then also man with whip. And both of these, along with a range of subjects, I think really deal with questions of kind of the interior and exterior of the body, holes, and movement between thresholds of interior and exterior. And then through that description, they were also inspired by a form from mathematics called the Klein bottle, which is a particular kind of theoretical form or figure from the field of topology, which in the Klein bottle, it's a surface where sort of the outside continues into the inside and the inside becomes the outside. So there's a kind of indeterminacy between interior and exterior of that form. This is another piece that has a kind of, the origin of it has a kind of hybrid character. This is a piece called Cactus Kuros Kintsugi, and this piece was inspired by kind of trying to create a sort of mashup of this cactus living in my studio that was sort of at the very end of its life. I never watered it, and it took on this sort of mutated, sort of desiccated form. And then the ancient Greek Kuros figures, and maybe more specifically Osamu Noguchi's representations of those figures and these sort of abstracted marble forms. And then the third part is kintsugi, which is the Japanese art of repairing broken ceramic pieces with little bits of gold. And somehow in a kind of confluence between these three sort of objects or forms, felt like a space in which to could sort of think about some notion of this sort of the awkwardness of the body approaching middle age. It's a kind of autobiographical piece. This is another piece that was made around the same time and dealing with, in a way, similar subject matter about, the body and how we give shape to not, figuration, but questions of the bodily experience, and particularly our bodies in relation to an increasing dependency on and interconnectedness with technologies of various kinds. So this was a piece called the Wad Kuvad. It's this large aluminum piece on the right-hand side of the screen. And this piece came about from an origin of just this little tiny wad of aluminum foil that this was just one of those little pieces of kind of debris like floating around at the edges of your studio. And one of those little objects, which I'm sure many of us have, or where, you know, there's just something about it that kind of causes you to not throw the thing away. So it just sort of keeps lingering. You know, it's probably been in the dustpan 20 times on the edge of being thrown out into the trash, and then something about it, right? You just decide that you're going to put that thing back on the shelf. And so, you know, after going through that kind of sequence a number of times, I decided that, well, there's something interesting about this form, so I need to kind of think about it in some other way. So I decided to take a really high-resolution 3D scan of it, and then through a pretty labor-intensive digital process, took that surface and unfolded it all into sheets, labeled all of the edges that would be folded with an angle to fold them at, put tabs on it that would allow me to rivet it back together and reconstruct it, and then had all of these panels water jet cut out of aluminum, and spent about 3 days folding this piece back up into this fairly large. This object is about as tall as I am. About 6 feet 3 inches tall, almost exactly. That was kind of the scalar reference to make it as tall as I am. And I made this piece over the course of about 9 months, when my wife Sonam actually was pregnant with our son William, and you know, the title Wad Kuvad really came out of that relationship. You know, the term kuvad is a term from anthropology, and it refers to sort of a whole range of practices through which, in, you know, sometimes incredibly absurd ways, men try to enact and empathize with the experience of childbirth in some way. Yeah, this piece became about that for me. The final idea that I'd like to talk about a little bit, but in a number of different ways, is this notion of relationships between parts and wholes as a kind of idea germane to ceramics and the ceramic field. And of course, you know, the relationship between parts and wholes, it's an incredibly broad idea, but it's a sort of way of framing a whole really broad set of thoughts that I often use and think about. And I mean a lot of different things by this. You know, first I mean just notions of series and sequence inherent in both sort of organizing and classifying pottery morphologies. I think about, you know, this same kind of sequential thinking as being at the core in some ways of like the potter's art, through which potters often, you know, make many sort of very similar iterations of a form as a way of kind of exploring possibilities like within a form type. I also think about relationships between parts and wholes in the context of architectural ceramics and tiling systems. This image on the right is an image of a medieval mosque in Esfahan, and with this beautiful pattern of tiles in the surface. And if you look very closely, there's something really interesting happening in these tiles where there's a limited number of shapes which are tessellating together. But if you look at the overall patterning actually doesn't have any repetition in it, or has very little repetition in it. And a number of years ago, a physicist named Peter Liu, I think in the early 2000s, when this was, he was from Harvard, Peter Liu from Harvard, was traveling in Iran, and he noticed this, and he wanted to kind of understand, like, at a mathematical level, what was going on here. And he was able to pretty convincingly demonstrate that in the construction of these medieval Islamic buildings, they were using a mathematical system called Penrose Tiling, which wasn't discovered in the West until the 1970s. So I'm really interested in this dynamic as well, you know, this idea of their ideas related to tiling or tessellation, but also this idea that, you know, these really complex kind of theoretical ideas can be at work or be born out of a very physical, pragmatic, kind of empirical process of sort of craftsmen working with their hands, working with materials, right? Trying to generate complex forms or geometries out of clay. And these are a series of projects now, which my projects, which kind of came about in a way that I think is similar. So these pieces started out by exploring, I was just sort of looking for interesting three-dimensional shapes or polyhedrons that would stack together in interesting ways. And the way I was doing that was just by cutting little pieces of foam core with an X-Acto knife and then gluing them together, building them into volumes, playing with the way they stacked up, and then slip casting these elements. Here they're cast then in a black clay material and then stacking these ceramic modules up to create sort of larger and larger aggregations of the pieces. And it was also a way of creating a kind of like site-responsive sculpture where the particular installations, the particular configurations would really respond to the geometry, architecture of the space that they were installed in. And I started getting interested in this shape. I came upon one kind of polyhedron and I was interested in the way it stacked together. I later discovered that this shape had a name. It's called a truncated octahedron. And I started getting interested in using that same shape, but to drive other possible versions or kinds of structures. So then I took that shape, and this is the same form but drawn in computer-aided design software, and then just using the edges of the volume to build these shell sort of structures, and then applying a second algorithm to them to kind of soften the surfaces into a more organic and porous form. And then working back into this pretty complex form, I was trying to find one element that I could cast over and over again to produce the overall geometry. So here's that one element that was sort of pulled out or extracted, and then what I did was I milled foam on the carved foam reductively on the CNC milling machine, and then cast plaster into the foam parts, and then put the plaster pieces together, poured slip inside of those, then you pour the slip back out, and these little elements come out of that that you can then stick together and start building larger modules. So here's that process of unpacking a mold. Then here I'm kind of looking for a module at a scale that, you know, you both can kind of pick up fairly easily, a scale that'll fit inside of the kiln, but also a form that once you fire it and it's a little bit sturdier, it'll stack in a way that actually supports itself, so you can actually build something in a kind of tectonic way easily in space without other kinds of fasteners. So these are the elements then. This is how they stack up, like that. And then here's a larger configuration. The same elements. Here's another piece in another material, in aluminum, water jet cut aluminum again, but it's using that same kind of underlying geometry, just sheets of aluminum that are riveted together, but still using that form of the truncated octahedron to kind of drive the construction of the overall form. In terms of this idea of parts and wholes, I've also been working on a series of these large kind of tile wall installations. This is the first version of this piece that I made actually about 10 years ago for an installation at the Denver Art Museum. And then I actually just completed another version. These are actually completely different tiles, but using sort of similar ideas and colors and a similar system. This piece was just installed a couple of weeks ago in an apartment building in Kansas City. The piece is made in a similar way. You know, I installed the piece in the computer, and then use this 3-axis CNC router hard foam, and then cast plaster against that foam, and then I'm pressing clay by hand into the plaster molds. In this piece there are actually 10 different tiles, and they change in a few ways moving through the piece. What I was interested in kind of formally with this piece is the idea that, you know, in some ways it's using sort of geometries that are really typical or common in ceramic tile pieces, where, you know, you're seeing an idea of tessellation or repetition of geometric elements sort of nesting together. But then you're also seeing these other kinds of geometries that are more atypical, certainly in historical architectural tiles. And this is the idea that there's a gradient moving through all of these. So this is something that we've seen more typically, at least before the advent of algorithmic and parametric modeling. We've seen more typically in natural systems than in human kind of built systems. So there are sort of 3 gradients moving through the piece. One is the gradient of the size of the tiles, so smallest at the bottom to biggest at the top. And the gradient isn't linear. They sort of shift through what's called a logarithm. And then you see the depth of the tile getting shallower and shallower as it moves from the bottom to the top of the piece. So the shadow becomes less and less pronounced. And then there's also a gradient in the glaze color, moving from a turquoise at the bottom to a white at the top. So again, I think this question about these ideas of parts and wholes and the way that we sort of reflect on them, consider them, and sort of ceramics becomes a way through which we think through questions of part and whole, which I think in many ways, you know, this notion of part and whole it's really fundamental to our kind of cognitive experience of the entire world, right? How we sort of separate objects from context or individual elements from a larger whole. It's a framework which creates so much of how we perceive the world in our universe, but there are many ways through ceramic objects that we have both sort of represented the sort of fundamental ways that we describe, consider, sort of contextualize this idea, and also the way we continue to use ceramic objects to unpack the complexity of this experience. So the third way I'd like to talk a little bit about another kind of thinking through parts and wholes is in the relationship between these things within the arrangements of the studio, the still life, and the garden. So rather than tessellation or sequence in these spaces, there's something more intuitive, more about a kind of intuitive, improvisational questions of composition and arrangement, maybe more open-ended, right, rather than such sort of rigid, structured ideas of arranging, and something maybe a little bit more tenuous or slippery in the way the interaction between the part and the whole sort of holds or fails to hold. This is one of a series of an ongoing body of work of mine that I think of as still lifes. And again, in the sense of still life painting. These pieces really come about by making many objects in the studio. Sometimes individual parts will be a part of another sequence or series, and then they're often sort of anomalies, maybe pieces that don't quite fit, maybe pieces that were discontinued from another kind of series, and then this work of building them into a still life is a kind of secondary work. Often the object kind of lingers in the periphery over a period of time, and then there's a kind of affinity maybe with something in its sort of accidentally in its proximity, and an affinity or a tension or a contrast or a kind of conversation, and out of those sort of provisional connections, these larger kind of aggregations seem to grow, almost like a crystal in a way. This is another recent piece that, I think of as a kind of still life, and again, it's a kind of conversation between elements and parts. Often with these still life pieces, they involve relationships, exploring relationships between structures, which I think of as being drawn from, a domestic interior, which is the kind of historical, like the typical space of a still life painting, where there's some kind of a table, right, or a surface operating as a frame for some kind of collection of elements. Usually the table is made from wood and the elements are made from ceramic. And in this piece I was interested in using that as a kind of sort of form structure kind of starting point, right? It's like the table and the ceramic object, but having the forms of those parts enter into some sort of conversation with each other, in which, the form of the ceramic object starts to more deeply kind of push against or influence the form of the table, vice versa. What if rather than simply sitting on top of the table, the ceramic object actually pierces or sort of perforates through or interrupts that surface in some other way? And then this is one final piece that I'd like to talk about. That it's a piece that I actually feel like I'm still processing in a lot of ways. It's a pretty recent piece. I just completed it in May, and it actually came out of a commission. It's a commission commissioned by a collection of sculptures commissioned by the U.S. State Department through the Art and Embassies program, for a new embassy building built in Nuevo Laredo, Mexico. And this is an image looking out of the window of my hotel room across the border into Mexico. As you've seen, this is an image of the this final collection of sculptures installed there in the building, in that space. As you've seen, I would say almost all of my work in some way sort of engages in ideas around the sort of problem of the ceramic container, the ceramic object as a container. And both in the vessel forms, the forms which I suppose contain sort of space in a literal sense, but also I think in the forms which, you know, explore some idea about the relationship of parts and wholes through the still life or the grouping, both sort of involve also questions of surfaces and thresholds and boundaries. You know, whether that's the physical surface of the ceramic form as a kind of shell, or the notion that in differentiating between this collection of elements which make up a still life as a kind of provisional set, and those things which are not included, then, right, there's an act of inclusion and also exclusion in the act of kind of composing a still life. Both of these things involve the creation of a kind of border or boundary or threshold, right? The boundary between things that are a part of that still life and are not. The things inside of the edge of the frame or the canvas and the things that are outside it. And I think I'm still sort of deeply processing, trying to unpack what it means to place a collection of pieces which are, for me, sort of all about thresholds and boundaries, right at the edge of this other kind of profound boundary or barrier, threshold in the world. Here's this collection of pieces installed in the embassy building. So it's a collection of sort of fairly large sculptural ceramic forms, and then they're placed on these concrete pedestals, which they asked me to cast to kind of orient or situate the pieces in the space. And with the configuration, their relationship to the space, some ideas about the forms themselves, and then also this relationship between materials and the form of the cast pedestal and the object. I was really thinking about the kind of historical notion of the sculpture garden, and specifically some of the sculpture gardens built by Osamu Noguchi. Here's an image just to give you a sense of scale. So these pieces were, some of them were hand-built, coil-built, using very old kind of traditional building techniques. And then other pieces employed some level of digital fabrication or digital modeling. This is a technique that I've been developing over the last few years, and it's these pieces are coil built, but then there's a texture applied to them just with the fingers through pinching, but it's a texture which really comes from looking at this kind of texture artifact of the digital modeling process. So it's like applying a kind of mesh or digital structure over the surface of a very analog, handmade form. With, you know, this collection of pieces and the experience of them, you know, I was very interested in this idea of the sculpture garden and also simply the garden kind of proper, and the way in the garden which sort of differences, different forms, kinds of plants, scales, textures are all interacting together and holding together to create a kind of sense of a larger whole. And in, you know, made objects, human-made objects, one of the things I'm very interested in is the way in which the process of making the piece leaves a kind of artifact of
a set of marks, which are a kind of artifact of the performance of making. So the way in which things like the kind of tool that is used, you know, the skill applied, but also simply the pace of making yields a wide range of sensibilities and kinds of textures or marks. So here's the final installation of this group of pieces. And that's the final image. So thank you very much for listening to the lecture. And yeah, thank you very much.
Let me turn on some lights, but if anyone has any questions?
I've got a question.
Oh, sorry.
There seems to me to be a couple of different breeds of ceramic artwork that employ the kind of technology that you work with.
Yeah.
And the one that is more interesting for me is the work in which the conceptual underpinnings, the connotations and implications of the process are related to the materials and meaning of the work. And I'm not totally up to speed with where we are in the ceramics field in terms of technology. I mean, there are definitely some artists on my radar, Jonathan Keith, Michael Eden, yourself. Where are we as a field with the technology in terms of the more sophisticated uses of it and the real pushing of the technology?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really big question. I think there are a few things happening simultaneously. You know, there's just like there are different sort of forces that drive innovation of any kind of technology in the culture. You know, you see people like with 3D printing, like just kind of pushing the sheer, power of the technology, for lack of a better word, and by that I mean speed, scale, complexity or intricacy. I could, kind of give you names of a number of people who I think are doing that kind of thing, and that's being driven, you know, in different ways, both by individual artists and then, you know, fairly small scale, I think, technology manufacturers. But then, like, I agree with you. I think the work that I'm most interested in is the work in which somehow the final form, whatever that is, becomes more interesting than the Instagram video of the process. So I've had a few moments recently where I felt like there was a kind of threshold that was crossed, and one of them for me personally was with Olivier Van Herp's work. Have you seen his 3D printed forms? So the work he's doing with 3D printing, and I felt like that was a real moment where he sort of hit some level where the intricacy of the printing combined with a sort of calibrated level of complexity, right, combined with a sensitivity to form and scale, achieved a sort of sense of poetry, like in the final object, right, rather than something that feels like it's sort of driven primarily by just sort of one of those agendas. So I think we're at a kind of threshold point, is my sense right now, where I'm starting to see more and more work like that, but I still think there isn't a ton of it out there. And I think it, like a lot of the, you know, digital fabrication technology we're using, it's actually been around for a while. You know, now I can't remember, the first CNC milling machines were, I think, developed, I could be wrong about this, but I think in like the 1950s. So there's a slow evolution, though, as the cost comes down enough, that there's enough sort of widespread dissemination of those that they can get in the hands of artists who also are deeply attentive to the aesthetic sensibility of the technology. And I think in that sense, even though the technology's been around for a long time, I feel like we're sort of right at the beginning of seeing a lot of like really of that technology reaching a level of maturity in the ceramic field. Christopher Wright is another example, I think, with his water jet cut porcelain panels that he's sort of slotting together into these really sort of mind-blowingly intricate vessel forms. Think about more examples.
I'm having a little difficulty from your first image to the image on the right. From hand produced to technology produced. I'm having difficulty with that connection.
Yeah, I mean, my sense, the way it feels inside of my practice, and I feel like I've said this for a number of years, and I'm not sure it was always true, or I always really felt it, but at this point I really do, that relationship between the hand, you saw the videos of the hand forms, right, and the clay, and the CNC milling machine, right? It really feels like part of a kind of continuum or ecology, right, which all feel like processes driven by maybe not technology in the way we typically think of it, but this larger sense of how do we give order and structure to our bodies, right, and then order and structure to a material. Go ahead, Ruben.
Well, I'm just, as far as technology, technique, nothing that man has made, or everything that we touch that is human generated, someone designed it. So there's a thought process about before the object became reality.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just kind of simplifying.
Yeah. I mean, I think what I'm interested in as an artist is, then the configuration of elements in this work, right? And so the mark from the machine and the mark from the hand, right? And the way in which those enter into a conversation or a larger whole with one another, whether or not you feel that difference holds or feels chaotic, right, or dissonant in the final work, I mean, that's really your judgment. I can't tell you that the work works, right? but it's good. I don't know if it's good.
I'm not arguing about the work itself.
Yeah. But that's my interest, right? Watching the way that, a faceted structure created through a digital modeling process and an algorithm sits next to a faceted structure that's shaped by my fingers pushing against the clay. And what happens when those things are in proximity to one another? And then following an aesthetic intuition at some level, right? And a belief that there's something at work there, a sense of rhythm, hopefully a sense of beauty, right? In the same sense that I think any artist is sort of searching for moments of rhythm, continuity, a tension between difference and similarity that strikes a chord somehow.
Your collapsed, faceted pots. Never mind.
I'd love to, I think kind of what you're describing right now is filtered its way into my question a little bit. So maybe to set this up, I'm thinking a little bit about, of course, your work makes us think about the difference between handwork and then the divorce from that computer-driven work. Of course, that's still designed by someone in mind, so it's another implement. But watching the videos, the time-lapse particularly, of you modeling something just by hand, which often ends up being a form that it's language anyway, it's sort of general form language anyhow, comes more from that digital aesthetic. And so there's often in your work I see this sort of flipping back and forth, and sometimes a little bit of guesswork about like, well, which thing actually happened? Maybe that question comes more from other makers. But my question is actually about humor, which pops up in the work in a number of places. But could I ask real directly, this thing that we're talking about, is there humor in that too? Like, do you see, not that there's a joke that we are going to belly laugh about, but a kind of question that there isn't an answer to, and ends up being the most peculiar thought ever, which in turn is kind of fun, right?
Yeah, I really love. Yeah, I love that question. I mean, I think I laugh a lot about a lot of this work.
There's other moments that I think are more directly humorous, and I'm so glad they're there.
Right.
But do you find this? I don't mean to say it like that.
I do. No, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think. Yeah, I mean, I could kind of. Yeah, I think I could think about that. I really appreciate that question. Yeah, I'd like to just think about it more. I mean, I think in so much of that. I mean, the reference to the Mapplethorpe photograph, and there's something about just the, I don't know, the sort of, sometimes the kind of stupid clumsiness of like living in this sack of material, right?
Yeah, the cactus piece, I forget the exact title, forgive me.
Yeah.
But, I find a lot of humor in that piece, especially when you give us a reference to it about being an awkward body.
Yeah, and then there's
We've
this...
all been there, and we all can't really laugh at that in the moment, of course, but then either after the fact, before the fact, from the perspective, there's, of course, something.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a bunch of ideas in there. I mean, the sort of weird aspirations that some people hold out for digital technology of like ideas like the singularity, right? That we're somehow going to sort of transcend the limitations of our corporeal like bodies and like just upload our consciousness into the cloud, right? And I think there's something really, I mean, there is something funny and absurd about like, in so much of the work, I'm interested in just like really pushing back against that.
Maybe absurd is a really good word for that. And it's that's a spectrum, of course, too.
Yeah.
I just maybe want to know it's the real fun end.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, there's something ridiculous about sort of pinching a faceted structure out of clay, right? Because of this speed, the limitations of speed, right? We just think about the comparison between, the speed of the processor working in my computer and the speed of my fingers pushing against the clay. And I think there's something funny about speeding those videos up too.
Yeah.
So I'm going hyper fast in this video.
Well, I think it's good stuff for
Speed
all
them
of
up
us
even more.
to think about the sort of connections between these things, the differences. Thanks for making work.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thank you.